Is it happening right now? Is it going to happen again? What do we need to do as Christian?
Welcome to the Unrefined Podcast. I'm Brandon Spain along with Lindsay Waters and BT Wallace, and together we explore the mysteries of the seen and the unseen, challenge conventional perspectives, and navigate the profound truths of our world, all through a biblical lens. Stay connected with us and gain exclusive access to our sponsors-only portal at unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, for this week's episode. All right. Yeah, guys, we're back with another fun episode this week, and we're on our deep diving of Operation Paperclip. We're really stoked about this series, and we think it's going to be a really good one. And so this would be the second installment in that series.
Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Especially after all the stuff we pulled out in the last episode. It's going to be a really interesting one. So just kind of starting out, we can get into the discussion and topic of it. Last time we really didn't go into detail, and that was on purpose. We wanted to lay a foundation of where we're coming from for the next episodes. What is Operation Paperclip? Is it a conspiracy? What is it? And I don't even really think it's a conspiracy anymore. I mean, it could be a conspiracy in the sense of how deep the rabbit hole goes, perhaps. People are full of speculation, and we're going to probably make some speculations in our series as well. And so it's important to caveat that. However, it is a known fact that Operation Paperclip existed and in some form or fashion is like what we're talking about. The evidence that it goes deeper, and then if we put our Christian worldview on top of that, it really shows that it's a conspiracy in the sense of from sinister forces and their conspiracy to control and rule the world with power. And to do that, they need people. And nothing better than World War II to give you an example of a pre-Antichrist, or an Antichrist actually himself. And so anyway, but Operation Paperclip, basically it got its name from the folders that these Germans we were talking about last week, the Nazis, when they came over, they tried to scrub them. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but to scrub them, they didn't want anybody to know that they were really former war criminals, let's be honest. And so they put paper clips on their folders to distinguish the Nazi guys and scientists and other things with the other folders. Yeah, so you get the point. So Operation Paperclip, the main purpose of it, though, at least it's on paper now that's been released through the government documents, it was to recruit valuable assets for the American government, the United States government, to bolster in certain areas, starting from rockets to missiles. That's the one that was really highly publicized, and the other big three, that weren't very publicized. The one being biological, because a lot of people have issues with biological warfare, and rightly so. And then chemical warfare, which to me is even more insidious. But that wasn't really publicized in this whole Operation Paperclip rabbit hole. They mostly focused on rockets, and NASA came out of this, and that's another whole show and rabbit hole. But whatever you think about NASA, but yeah, and the last one I forgot about is the whole psychological dimension. I forget the percentage, but there was huge percentage of German psychoanalysts and psychiatrists and psychologists. That was the fatherland of psychology. I mean, Freud, XXX, it came out of German soil. So they weren't very widely publicized either. Psychologists, the psyche type situations. And so we're going to go into the different avenues. And I wanted to bring that up because we talked about last time about the sister forces and the gifts that the fallen watchers gave to man. And we're hitting different areas here. It's really interesting, the whole German concept of they were trying to actually bring the kingdom of darkness on earth, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. And I see a lot of sets up of creating culture, stealing other culture to make your culture a culture of power. Satanism or occultic is it's about power, and that's what the whole Nazi Reich was about power, even through occultic means. So anyway, the other thing that really makes Operation Paperclip to me interesting, but also sketchy in some ways, is there's still a lot of secrecy around it. There's still a lot of stuff that we don't know that it hadn't been far enough removed to be released. And then we all know there's black ops stuff that never gets released. It gets shredded or burned or whatever. And so there's things we're never going to know about it. So let's dive into what we do know about it. And I'm going to go through a list of some scientists and we can talk about them, guys, their contributions. And y'all feel free, interrupt me and chime in with this. I don't want this to just be a Brandon deal here. So the first one is truly one of the most famous of the rocket, the V2 rocket production guy. And honestly, did a lot of real good for the United States government, for our defense, for our rocket program from NASA and all this kind of stuff, and was looked up to as a hero. Lindsay talked about him in the last episode. What movie was that, Lindsay?
October Sky.
Jake Gyllenhaal. Yeah. And so, he was almost a hero. His name was Wunderbaum Braun. And it's really amazing how history has been whitewashed. See, I'm just going to say it. I see two sides of political spectrum that both lie. All right. And, I was always taught that history was written by winners. And so when that's the case, history's been whitewashed just as much from a traditional or conservative side as it has been from a liberal or radical side too. And so they had to whitewash all this Nazi stuff out of the picture. And so they promoted him as this great rocket scientist. He was in charge of it. He was the director of the whole V2 in Germany. And then he invented the Saturn V rocket by NASA. And that was incredible. It took astronauts to the moon. I mean, what a great guy. But here's the deal. What we didn't know about him is his past contributions with the whole rocket program was nuclear. He was one of the first ones to look into installing nukes in rockets, not just in bombs like we already had, which we haven't dropped yet. The people don't realize this, but when Germany fell, it took a minute for Japan to fall. It wasn't the end of the war, and we all know what caused the end of the war. It was the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But von Braun, he was ready to put these on missile heads, like BT said last time. And just think about this. From Colorado, you can hit anywhere in the world, just about. And that's an incredible amount of power. And so anyway, so he brought that to America. Well, if history's whitewashed and we didn't know this guy was a diehard Nazi, we would be like, oh, wow. But he was a diehard Nazi and did atrocious things and this is what really gets me sometimes, and was aware of atrocious things that were going on and said nothing. That is, and I'll get into that on a later podcast. That's what really saddens me about America. Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
Arguably worse, because we'll get into more of this probably in this one, but even if you grant this, I was just following orders, you hear that a lot, or I was made to do this, or I was an opportunist wanting to further the science. Is that better, knowing what was going on? So yeah, I just want to throw that in there.
No, that's incredibly true. We need to think about that.
Yeah, because where von Braun was doing his experiments, building the V2 rockets, was done at a specific concentration camp. Mittelblau.
Middlework? Is it Middlewerk?
Or something like that. Yeah, it's not like these words are really easy for us English speakers to pronounce.
Yeah, and there was Nordhausen was another one.
Yeah.
The ash can.
Yeah, they took the concentration camp prisoners and subjected them to brutal conditions. I mean, they starved them.
Slave labor.
They dealt with disease. It was, no doubt. Thousands of people died, prisoners, slaves, building these missiles for von Braun. And he had to have been aware of it because according to the testimonies, von Braun visits these sites frequently and he knows the conditions and he would have been aware of them. But because he was part of the higher class, he was a scientist, so he had to write over these people, and he's just sick that they turned a blind eye to that.
Yeah, and I like what you said the other day. BT and I were chatting just about this upcoming podcast and research, and I said Herr von Braun, and he's like, he's not a Herr. He's not worthy of that title of being a Herr.
Yeah, no, these guys, they all have these honorifics and these titles that were all part of the
Pomp of
Nazi royalty and the pomp
yeah,
and circumstance about it. But, someone like Braun who just says, I was an engineer and a scientist, not a policymaker, brings back the accounts of the ordinary men, the police division, the 101st Police Division in Poland, who went in and just became debauched, disgusting humans because they were allowed to be. It's the same thing. Just because you see evil going on and do nothing, while you might not be culpable of doing evil directly, you permitted it by your inaction.
yeah. Somebody pushes somebody in a pool, and they start to drown, and you stand there and watch them drown. They call it accessory after the fact, but you're a murderer too. And we're going to say that about every one of these guys because
But it's like, dude, not to interrupt.
no, cool.
It's something on my mind, and it's like I was thinking about this when we were recording our last episode on this topic. As I painted the picture for the background of the Sinister Forces, the fact is there's a historical debate that goes on, and this applies to every single scientist. But while we're talking about Victor von Braun, first and foremost, because he's like maybe the least culpable,
Maybe.
as a right. I mean, this is the thing. The American government saw him as a man who sacrificed his ethics for scientific progress. That, if nothing else, is a definition of evil. I needed to get that off my chest because it's like, just because he was trapped in a situation where a dissent or disobedience would have caused his death, he still chose to participate. And you cannot tell me that his legacy of ethics didn't come with him when he came to America.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No. And that's, to me, what makes Operation Paperclip a conspiracy, a crime. And the culpability here, you guys, and man, I hate to even say this, but it's reality. The culpability here is not just on the side of the guys who came. It's also on the side of the guys who invited, and that's not just the United States. We have Brits, and when in the Soviets, so they were our next quote evil unquote. So, but we expected them to do that, but not us. And that's the whitewashing I was talking about earlier, rewriting of history by people who would be considered conservatives now.
That was the point. That was the specter of communism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The whole aim was to make an invisible enemy. I mean, like, we didn't see that happen with 9/11 and the terrorist thing and the enactment of the Patriot Act. This is a nonstop. This happens where you have an invisible enemy, and it might be a communist. And it's just like, turn your neighbor in. There might be a communist. I mean, this was a thing in the United States. It was kind of an interesting thing going and living through like the early 2000s, where if you were just brown skinned, that was enough to be culpable of being a terrorist or associated with it. There was so much nasty. This was happening during Cold War America, and their skin tone wasn't different. They just looked Russian. Is all it took.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. But and this is something I've learned about the elites just in my time outside the matrix. How about that? Is that the elites, the means don't justify the ends. I forget the phenomena, but it's taught that they see it as for the better good, that at all cost for the better good, and it's this some sort of a story or a myth. But it was actually, what was funny, I was reading about it, and it was in a program we were watching where this government agent told somebody it's about what happens, and how we get there is irrelevant. That's from our worldview of Christianity. That's not okay.
Well, who else do we see besides Victor von Braun? Yeah, sure, he worked with Jack Parsons too, JPL, but
Yeah. Well, if you want to stick with, we have a few of the different sections, but this is another NASA guy, Hubertus Strunghold. He was the space medicine guy. He did a lot of, he's more biological and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the biowarfare dude.
Yep. And then Arthur Rudolph was another one that helped with von Braun, and then Parsons later on, and with the whole rocket program. He was the director of the Mittelwerk. I'm trying to use my German accent. Mittelwerk, which is the plant where they actually stored some of the prisoners after Germany had surrendered or whatever. But that's where they built the V2 rockets during the war. Then you got some of the lesser knowns, but they were the ones to me were the most insidious and dangerous. The ones that operated on humans as victims. And I have to tell you a fascinating story that I read about this. That they put a group of these guys in a room and they showed them a movie. Have y'all heard about this? Did y'all read anything about study about this? Yeah, Lindsay did. And so correct me if I get anything wrong. And they were showing the atrociousness of what went through the concentration camps. One guy started to gag in his handkerchief, and then another guy pulled him aside after the movie and said, "I have something really awful to tell you." He just commenced on talking about all the stuff and named names and did all this kind of stuff, and then boom, he gets on the stand in Nuremberg and me know nothing.
Well, Goering was watching that film, and he just kind of sighed. Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe, and
Yeah,
Hitler, arguably Hitler's number 2 or number 3 man.
3 man,
He
yeah.
just kind of sighed and just kind of acted like he was bored, apparently.
Yeah, like, we know this, no crap. Yeah, whatever. That's very actually sociopathic, probably. But see, that's the interesting thing about a lot of these guys is, I wonder about their mental health. I'd like to think that we're all sinners and we're all capable of doing anything or whatever. But I just some of the stuff I just don't think the average person with mental health would do. The lack of ethics there, and I guess you can get mind controlled by brainwashing and all that stuff. Yeah. It just depends on the worldview you submerge yourself in. And they had, through these sinister forces, they constructed another worldview. And that's how a lot of the innocent civilians got involved in it. They were proud of their country. Sound familiar? We could be duped. We could. I would like to say that I would be a Bonhoeffer, but I can't promise myself that without the Holy Spirit, without his work in my life. It's a special grace to be a martyr, to stand up to that. But anyway, all right, Walter Schreiber, he did medical stuff. Eric Trobe. There's numerous other guys, and I have a full list here, and I'm not going to bore you with going through the whole list. Heinrich Himmler was Hitler's number 2. He had his hands in all this, and he was the one that pushed biological warfare because, believe it or not, Hitler was not for biological warfare. Hitler was against it, and Himmler had a shadow government underneath Hitler, which was a lot worse. There's even been arguments and books written that Himmler was really the true Führer, even though he was the Unterführer, but was one of the true Führer of the whole Third Reich. But anyway, there was good things that came from these scientists, and I can't be remiss to not mention the fact we're going to space exploration. Forgive me, flat earthers out there, just bear with me. Anyway, and just medicine, some of the medical things that they came up with were just incredible. And it wasn't all about biological warfare. They did medicinal things as well. The biggest one was the military technology, which in our time and day, military technology is not used necessarily to wage war as it is to just even the odds where war won't happen. It's supposed to be more defensive, and that was what the whole arms race was back in the 80s. I remember living through that whole ordeal with Gorbachev, and it was really, even to a kid or a teenager back in the 80s, it didn't make sense. I mean, why do that? Why, we were trying to keep the numbers accurate, but if it wasn't for the Germans and Operation Paperclip, we wouldn't have had that technology to be able to stay ahead of who we were taught were the moral insuperior Russians, the commies. So, which is true, they were communist. I'm not making light of that, but anyway. So, but the biggest thing that comes back when I wanted to look at this through a Christian worldview is just the ethical questions. We've talked about, do the ends justify the means? What do y'all think about all that? The ends justifying the means. I mean, is there ever a possibility that that's okay?
Well, one should never do an evil act so that good would come of it, first
Right.
of all.
Right.
I mean, that's like a moral stand. I mean, you could stand on that. You could take that to the bank.
Yeah.
You should never commit evil so that good can come from it, right? I mean, God will use the evil actions of the enemy so that good can come from it. We learn that
Right.
from the story of Joseph. But we, as instruments of or the body of Christ should not be engaging in acts of evil so that good can come from it. It's like if we were asked the question, if you had a time machine and you can go back in time and kill Adolf Hitler, would you do it? Well, that would be kind of an interesting question, and that would be an act of evil because you're going back in time or to kill an infant Adolf Hitler, basically.
Premeditated too, yeah.
Right, so you're actually doing like a series of sins in this case. So you're not just committing murder, you're premeditating, so it's complete sin. But aren't you doing it so that Adolf... Well, dude, anybody could be an Adolf Hitler. Anybody could be turned into an Adolf Hitler. It doesn't take a whole lot. And the Nazi regimes were brilliant at it. Their propaganda machine, hands down, 10 out of 10 stars. I mean, those guys had propaganda handled from the moment a child was born to the moment an adult died. They were subjected to a level of propaganda that could not be compared to, well, can probably be compared to today. But the use of radio, the use of posters, the use of visual imagery was brand new. So there's no doubt in my mind that it would have just been another person. Adolf Hitler would have just been another person. That machine and that impetus was already growing. The point was already there.
Yeah.
And the field was ripe and it was ready for harvest. And to answer the question, would I go back in time? I would be the psycho. I would be the insane person murdering an innocent and blabbering that this guy would have brought the Third Reich into existence. I mean, what is that?
But just the whole question of communism, I want to speak to that.
Let's go.
Because that was the big justification.
Exactly. Yep.
And we see that justification now with the, the far left, and the question of who are we willing to hitch our wagon to combat this evil. When you really look at the whole communist threat, though, I mean, the USSR ultimately just collapsed on its own. Oh, it couldn't have kept up that machine going. And you could, the whole argument about the Vietnam War, which we know there were more agendas going on
Just like the Iraq War too.
there. But yeah, when we left Vietnam, there wasn't some domino effect that made its way all the way back to us. That didn't happen. If anything, our institutions were already infiltrated long before that.
Yes.
Our colleges and whatnot, we're seeing the fruit of that now. But I mean, did combating the USSR help that? I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to get at is we decided that arguably one of the most evil regimes that had ever existed, that we had just defeated with the help of the USSR, interestingly enough, we decided that, yeah, they were bad, but these guys are worse, and we're going to use some of their tactics, even some of their interrogation, whatnot, weaponry, chemical and bio warfare, or at least we're going to keep it at the ready in case we need it, because this threat is bigger. You could even relate this to the Chilean dictator Pinochet, how we supported him economically and otherwise. We sent economists there. Yeah, Pol Pot, his big thing was he was combating communism in his country, throwing people out of helicopters in Chile, and even using occult facilities to help interrogate people. And we were implicit in that. And was communism any worse than the guys we brought over to help combat it? It's bad. Yeah, I think all three of us agree with that. When you're talking about a totalitarian government, they're not much different.
You're right.
From the so-called right-wing version to the so-called left-wing version, that at the end of the day, they're not much different. I mean, the Nazis were socialists. Maybe not Marxist socialists, but a lot of the same stuff was there. And I think Amy from Eyes on the Right talked about how people will use good causes to deceive people and hook people into their bad cause, like with the whole child trafficking, the P word.
Yeah.
And I think communism and the far left, and even in our days, the whole woke ideology, critical race theory, we can use that sometimes as an excuse to... Evil people is what I'm saying. We'll use that as an excuse to get people on their side. So, yeah. I mean, at what cost?
At what cost? Yep. Yeah, and I can't sit here and argue with the fact that the everything that was done pretty much in this Operation Paperclip was stymied towards that supposed uh, Cold War situation with the Cubans, later with Vietnam, with Russia primarily first. And something interesting you said, Lindsay. There's no difference between the communist regime versus the Nazi regime. They're both totalitarian. But what's interesting about it is they both did, and the more left wing one, I guess, would say they're atheistic. But they had the occult, and BT could testify to this in Russian culture. The Soviet Union, with their intelligence, just as in depth into the occult as any other nation. You know, OSS, CIA, MI6, all the intelligence things. And I wonder oftentimes if intelligence community is the like new superpower secret society that's really controlling it. We say it's the Masons, but I almost wonder if the intelligence community in the world, no matter what country, is just an offshoot of that whatever secret society, the cabal that's, obviously I think multiple ones that are controlling this. But anyway, this can all be tracked back to Enoch and the knowledge. But then even going forward, it can all be tracked back to Operation Paperclip, because it wasn't too far after this that we started experimenting with social engineering, with the whole countercultural movement, which we talked about with Laurel Canyon and all that. But you have to realize, you guys, as Hollywood has us convinced that the CIA is okay and they're American and they're looking out for our best interest. And that itself is propaganda, just like the Russians. Like VT just said, Germans might have started it excellente or whatever, but we're perfecting it definitely. And it stems back to Operation Paperclip. It stems back to these scientists that we let out, we let go, we pardon them. And the American people didn't know this for years. Do you remember, Lindsay, what year was all this? It was 85 that it was made known. It was a rumor, but it wasn't officially.
I know some things came out in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Particularly about like Klaus Barbie, who I'm sure we'll get into. I'm going to get into him some.
Yeah.
Things like that. But yeah. And there were people who didn't like the idea that we had Nazi scientists here. There was some pushback on it for sure.
Yeah, it was a rumor. It was a rumor, but it wasn't released government data yet. But it was definitely a rumor. People knew that. But they shifted it. They said, but look over here. The Soviets, the Cold War, the Cubans, they're your enemies. These guys are on the side of America. And that goes back to Machiavelli, and that goes back to the Prince. I mean, that's just how you play politics and war and all that control, manipulation and stuff. And which, in my opinion, he was a severely disturbed man and probably had demons as his muses. But we won't go there. That's fundamental reading for all despots. So, but if I, wrap up what I'm saying here, we can continue to talk more about scientists that I may have left out that y'all think I need to bring in. I just think that everybody out there, we need to think about that whole concept. And I wish I can remember what it's called when we do our next episode. I'll bring it on the show. It's some sort of a mantra or even a concept that the elite tell themselves. And I can remember there was two women, they were talking in the back seat, and one of them explained to the other one basically that, this is what it's about. It's about the ends justifying the means. But they didn't use it in that sense. They made it they spun it in a way to where it actually was plausible. So that's the first question I have. The second question is this for our audience: is it happening right now? Is it going to happen again? What do we need to do as Christians? Well, obviously we need to be aware, and we'll talk more about the spiritual ramifications of this whole ordeal later. But we need to pray. When you're given a choice and both choices are bad choices, you pray for whoever wins. You pray for the choice that wins, and you pray and you bless. And even if it's an enemy, and that's really hard because we don't want the means justify the ends.
Well, it's like they operated under this idea that history would vindicate their decisions. Like we know that history is typically written by the victor, or so we're
Yes.
told. And so that means history will vindicate our actions. Well, we look at Dr. Death, Joseph Mengele, and we could say, actually, there should be no reason why history would vindicate the atrocities this man committed.
Well, I want to caveat something. One of the reasons I didn't bring him up, even though he's crucial to all this, is because he fled and he was never part of Operation Paperclip. He fled to Brazil, Argentina and Brazil, and I
Right.
think he was buried in Brazil. But anyway, I just want to throw that. I didn't bring him in. Yeah, supposedly, right.
Supposedly. Some of these guys may find themselves that they're chosen by fate or divine will, right? I mean, it's the whole divine right to rule concept being played out in real time. I mean, almost in real time, I guess you could say that. Or, maybe they believe people aren't really ready to hear the truth. You gotta somehow subscribe to the idea that certain truths must be hidden from the public for our own good, which is commonly the one that you hear related or associated with some kind of X-File or something like that, right? It's like humans aren't really ready to know that E.T. has been phoning home for a long time. But just imagine, as I mentioned earlier, that people who defend bringing Victor von Braun here, that his sacrifices were for progress. These elite groups can simply evoke that as a mantra and say it was necessary to sacrifice a few for the advancements of many.
Yeah, betterment of the good. Yep.
So yeah, it basically takes unethical actions and makes them acceptable if they can contribute to a perceived societal progress. In modern times, I can think of the thousands who have died in Africa due to the experimentation of malaria injections. I mean, that's a prime example. That's researchable.
Yeah.
You can identify the man who's not a doctor or a scientist or a medical personnel of any kind who stole processing technology from his buddy, financing that one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not that difficult to sit there and he's experimenting on the lives of thousands of people every day in Africa because what's a few deaths for the progress of science? That's that Nazi. That's that idea. That's that sinister forces mentality. It doesn't matter as long as we kill some of God's image bearers.
Yeah. Yep. So, are there any other scientists that in Operation Paperclip that you guys know about that you'd like to talk about?
I think we mentioned Ambrose a little bit
Yeah.
earlier. Otto
Otto
Ambrose.
Otto Ambrose. Yeah.
He was working with Dow Chemical at one point. There was a guy.
Yeah.
US,
U.S. German.
yeah, but no, there was I forget the guy's name. Was kind of sneaking him around, trying to keep them from nabbing him, basically. And
Military
was
guy, a colonel,
yeah,
a
he
lieutenant
yeah
colonel. Yep.
yeah he was. Meanwhile, he's in talks with a guy who worked for Dow Chemical. So yeah, I mean, he's worth mentioning just to show that there was a aspect to this where it was not just going to help us defense wise and otherwise, but man, the people were looking for ways to how can we could make money out of this.
Oh yeah. Well, he was one of the ones that was primary on the nerve gas, sarin gas.
Sarin and Tauben, a similar
Tauben.
one that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
very deadly.
Yeah. And he was one of the instrumental, at least in producing it. Yeah, that's just to me when you get into that kind of chemical warfare. Yeah, it's all raunchy. Even when you come in and you kill animals, your cows and etc., and they kill all the grass and it kills the cows or vice versa. What I mean, that's still awful, even though it's not necessarily affecting humans. But the ones that affect humans, chemical warfare wise, and biological is bad too. Don't get me wrong, but the chemical ones are just cruel and unusual punishment, and they use that on Jews in concentration camps.
Yeah, I had mentioned in our first episode on this series, Dr. Kurt Blom.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, while I mentioned a name, I didn't talk about him because I figured I'd have an opportunity here to address who this guy was. He was basically the head of biological and cancer research for the Third Reich. And his primary job was to find ways to make people immune to the plague by making them infected with the plague.
Is he the one that went to Turkey to find the chemicals that he needed, or was that another
He
guy?
went
would-
or sent somebody at least.
Yeah, sent
yeah.
somebody. I mean, there's like there's a couple of people that are involved in this. Like his direct boss was Himmler.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's who he answered to in this biological research. But he also was involved in working with the Japanese, where they had
Interesting.
actually taken viruses and diseases and put them into like Japanese subs. And what they would do is they would just take these subs and they were infected with the plague, dengue fever, whatever, and they would just be sent out. And the goal was to have them just go somewhere, come ashore, and be treated. And in the implication of being treated, they would spread what they had. This is the 40s. It wasn't like we had big hazmat biological contamination resources available to just take this situation and isolate it from the rest of everything else.
Right.
Imagine it's 2024 and you are in any given country and you are exposed to a modified virus of some kind that's highly contagious that you've taken and you've messed with and you've experimented with and you've added protein to it that makes it much more transmissible. And then you have a breach in your facility, your experiment gets out. And just imagine what would happen today if an experimental virus was released intentionally, unintentionally, on a massive population that was designed to spread like, wildfire, I guess. What would be the reaction? Well, the reaction for the Germans was to experiment on those who had it with experimental procedures that probably may do more harm than good or have been shown to do more harm than good. And so it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort for us before to look back 4 years ago to an event. I'm not going to mention the event that caused mass panic on a global scale. That was what Dr. Kurt Blom and Himmler were trying to do. They wanted to make the Western Allies infected with the plague, where they would just be wiped out and they can go in and easily seize the land.
Yeah, they even wanted to send ships and release rats. They investigated with us. They released rats, and they did it so many times where they were trying to figure out how far they would go, and it ended up being a wash, but pun intended.
No, because it was easier for humans to be infected with plague and to spread it
Yes.
than it was to take a rat that's infected with plague and to spread it. Bubonic plague spread faster and more readily, not just because of the rats, but because the first thing you do is you make cats illegal. You can't curtail a rat population if you have no cats. You make cats illegal. You see, what you do is you slowly get rid of the things that make something controllable before you let the next thing happen. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm not going to call the bubonic plague of medieval Europe a conspiracy, but it seems really odd that bubonic plague happens after they made cats illegal.
Mhm.
That's fascinating. Yep.
What was Hitler's issue with the biowarfare? He was afraid it would backfire or something, I
Yes.
guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and believe it or not, this is going to shock people out there. He had a moral problem with it. Dallas Willard said this something years ago. He came out with his book Divine Conspiracy. It's a great book. So if you haven't read it, you need to read it. But anyway, he's just talking about ethics and talking about just the nature of good, and he said that even Hitler, in his twisted sociopathic mind, saw what he was doing was good.
Yeah, I mean, he
It
didn't
was
think he
for the
was a
good.
mustache twirling villain.
No, no. He thought he was doing a dominion mandate to install the Reich, which is kingdom,
Yeah.
in the world. Do I think that's true? No, but that's the nature of the enemy and the sinister forces, is they can take something good and they can refocus it and redo it and make it. They can do the same thing with something bad. They can take it and twist it. It goes back to what we were talking about, to the ends justify the means. That's where the enemy wants to get you, is in the journey, not the destination.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. As we talk about how some of this could happen, how the German society would get so used to these kinds of horrific things happening, and how countrymen would defend it and go to war over it. It's like you got a propaganda arm, and propaganda is very nefarious, it's very sneaky. Typically expect to see it, but one of the big things that the Germans did is they would focus on the German victories. They would publish German victories in the newspaper. They would never publish a loss. They would redo victories that were in lands far away that, people couldn't just... We didn't have TikTok to go to and say, oh yeah, look around. I'm in downtown Poland and there is no Germans here. They couldn't do anything like that. They could produce victories of German warfare. Obviously, they took Poland. I'm not saying that didn't happen. But the main goal of this propaganda arm was to produce sounds that you would repeatedly hear that German society is doing good. Communism is being defeated in the Eastern Front, the Western Front. The victories are ours, and we are reclaiming our German heritage, or, whatever scheme was the plan.
Yeah.
What does it take? It takes repeated messaging of a specific traumatic level to cause people to be cowed into submission. We have reports, and it shows data isn't very difficult to reproduce. It may be in a different focus into modern mainstream society, that if you don't do your part, you will kill your grandma. It was that easy. If you don't do your part, you're going to kill the elderly or the children.
Yeah.
It's common and constant that the use of propaganda to persuade people of simple minds to fall into line, to put the mask on because your airborne virus could be transmitted through toilet paper.
But not just for your sake, but for the sake
of the children and your grandparents.
Yeah.
That's the propaganda. That is exactly how Germany was able to do the horrific things that they did. They stood in line and they took the jab.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I'm thinking we'll land this plane, wrap it up here, and on our next episode, well, you'll just have to find out what it's going to be about. I'm not going to say it. We'll see.
Something to look forward to.
Something to look forward to. Yeah, we're going to go in even deeper. And so thank you guys for listening today.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.